The greatest miracle of all time, the resurrection, how did you integrate that into your scientific worldview?
With surprisingly little difficulty. The Bible is not a science book. We know everything except what's going on with the origin of life. There shouldn't be life. Life should not exist. It doesn't make any sense that matter is crawling around and doing things. The more we learn about science, the more we see pointers to God. The purpose of the Bible is to give glory to God and to tell the people reading it, this is what happened and this is who you are. You're good and you're bad. You're sad and you're joyful. You know, you're dumb and you're smart. You're humans.
Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am here in person again with Dr. Cy Garte. Cy, it's great to be with you again. This is actually sort of an extension of our previous talk that is nearing how many views? 1 million views at this point, where we looked at the science that led you from atheism to Christianity. And so this is kind of an extension of that interview. We want to go deeper into the second part of your book, which is basically, what does it look like to be a scientist as a Christian? You know, what is the aftermath of becoming a Christian as a scientist?
Well, I think where we ended last time, and also happens to be the end of the first part of my book, was that I had had this experience and I realized that I was a believer, and I said out loud, I'm a believer, and everything changed from that moment. But what happened next is, the next thing I said to myself is, now what?
Yeah.
Because I knew very little about Christianity other than what I had read in the Bible, and I had read a few other things like the Catholic Catechism and some other things, but I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know anything about churches. I didn't know anything about how a scientist could be a Christian. What did it mean I would have to give up my scientific worldview? I didn't know any other.
Would you have to become a young Earth creationist?
Oh yeah, I honestly would. I have to drop evolution as something that I held to be correct. I didn't know any other colleagues of mine in the sciences who were Christians.
Were you scared?
I wasn't scared. I had my belief was so strong. It was such a powerful experience to come into that belief system that I felt that would sustain me. But I didn't know what to do, so I just kept very quiet. I didn't tell anyone that I had had this experience. I didn't announce to anyone that I'm now a Christian.
Nobody?
Nobody. I didn't know. I was afraid of what I was afraid of was what would happen after I said that. And people say to me, "Are you nuts? Are you crazy?" So I didn't know what to do, and I also had questions for myself. I didn't know, how I would deal with all the things that I had been taught. The idea that Christianity was responsible for so much of the historical evil in human civilization. Was that true? So I had a lot of work to do, and I started doing it. I started reading a lot more about history, about the history of the church, world history in general, which history was always one of my favorite subjects, so I love reading history anyway. But the history that I had read had been very negative with respect to Christianity, and I started reading other history, there's plenty of it out there, and realized that a lot of things I had been taught were either exaggerated or simply not true.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Often you will see people saying that Christianity was responsible for all or most or the majority of wars and deaths and horrible things that happen in history. That's completely false. All you have to do is look at Wikipedia. It's very clear that if you look at the history of wars, Christian wars, either wars of Christians against others or between Christians, account for about 5% of the total deaths in world history. The rest being totally non-religious war. And actually, that's religious wars. That even includes Islam and other religions. The reality is that most deaths occur, most warfare occurs, and most killings and deaths of people by other people occur in non-religious contexts. Okay, well, that was nice to understand. When people say, oh, what about the Crusades? What about the Inquisition? Yeah, those were bad things, but they were minor in comparison to things like some of the Chinese civil wars, which had nothing to do with religion, or some of the other horrible events, like many of them in the 20th century, the Second World War, the effect of Chinese communism on survival, and things like that. So that was helpful. I also began looking more into the whole question of whether it was possible for for scientists to be Christian. And I was very fortunate because roughly at that time, I discovered a fairly recent book at the time published by Francis Collins, who I had no idea was a Christian. I certainly knew who he was. He was a very famous geneticist who was at that time leading the Human Genome Research Institute and the Human Genome Project. And he wrote a book called The Language of God. And I read that. And it's still an extremely popular book all these years later, and it opened everything for me, because this is one of the most brilliant scientists in our time, who is a completely devout evangelical Christian, and I didn't know that at all.
What is one big takeaway from the book that you remember?
The huge one was simply that there was no conflict between science and religious faith. And you remember in our last interview, that's how I ended the discussion, was I said, you asked me what is the takeaway message that I want to bring, and that's it, that there is no conflict between Christian religion, Christianity, and scientific faith. And if you're told that there is, it's false.
So roughly, how did he argue for that? Or how did he convince you of that thesis?
Well, the book describes the language of God is, of course, the genetic code, and he is a geneticist, and he knows everything there is to know about DNA and genetics. And he talks about the science, and he talks about his faith. He came to faith through an interesting process, which involved issues like the moral code. He was a physician at one point, clinically active in hospital wards. And a dying patient of his asked him, "What do you believe in, doctor?" Because he saw that this woman who was dying, knew she was dying, was very calm, and she was a very religious Christian. And when she asked him, "What do you believe in?" he realized he didn't have an answer. And that got him thinking, and the final step for him was a time when he was hiking, and he looked around and he was just simply overcome by the beauty of God's creation.
So beauty played a big part.
And so lots of people know that nature is beautiful.
Yeah.
But he put that together with this woman's question, "What do you believe in?" And look at the beauty of nature. And he realized at that point that he was a believer in God, in the Creator. Now, the difference between Francis and I was that Francis had not grown up as a Christian, but his family was somewhat, they went to church occasionally, apparently. And so he didn't have to go through many stages that I had to go through, which I talked about last time. It all came together for him. And that's what often happens. Everything just comes together and makes sense. And when I read that book, and I finished it, and I saw, the testimony of Francis Collins, that it all came together for him, as it had come finally for me through the work of the Holy Spirit, that was another, I wouldn't say another help to my faith, because I was already there, but it was a reinforcement. And it allowed me to not worry so much about how will I make it in the world as a scientist, you know, which I was still actively doing research with this, what I used to call crazy worldview. And I had the confidence to go ahead. And not only that, I had the confidence to seek out other Christians in the sciences. And I found them. I got online, I started looking, I discovered Biologos, which had been started by Francis Collins. Biologos is a group of Christians who hold completely to mainstream science, including evolution. And then I discovered something called the American Scientific Affiliation, which is a group of, a fairly large group, 3,000 or 4,000 members of scientists, many of whom are on the faculty of Christian colleges. Not all, but many. And others are just, you know, they're Christians and scientists. And that's a very active organization. I joined it. I'm now a fellow. So it's a very important organization. They don't have any standard view on science. So there are young earth creationists, there are ID people, evolutionary creationists. So it's different from Biologos, which is only evolutionary creation. So that was, you know, that took a few more years. That was in 2010 when I first discovered that organization. And of course, later I discovered others, reasons to believe. Hugh Ross, Buzz Rana has just taken over that. I've met them both, wonderful people. Their ideology related to science is old Earth, and not completely on board with everything in evolution. They have some questions about that, but again, I'm sort of now in the middle there myself.
What do you mean?
Well, I consider myself an evolutionary creationist still, but I also have for many years been questioning the completeness of evolution, and I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. I don't think that evolution is a complete theory. I think we need to expand it, and I'm not alone. There are many people who agree with that, not all of them, most of them not theists, in fact. But I happen to hold the belief that the more we learn about science, the more we see pointers to God. That was true in physics. Physics in the 19th century was very mechanical, very deterministic. When Einstein and Planck and all the quantum theorists, Heisenberg, et cetera, renewed physics in the 20th century, when physics became freed of its deterministic strictures, I think many pointers to God appeared. We have the fine-tuning of the constants, the cosmological constants. We have the uncertainty principle, which tells us we can't know everything about everything from science. It's impossible. These are all scientific, this is not gaps, these are scientific knowledge that point us to the reality of the Creator. And that has not happened in biology because, for historical reasons, biologists have always been very defensive about metaphysics and about the possibility of letting the camel of theology into the tent. So there is a very prevalent philosophical, I would say almost religious attitude in biology to keep out anything that looks like it's not strictly deterministic and reductionist. Mm-hmm. Now, the theory of evolution kind of does that because it doesn't require anything other than just, you know, naturalism. But it's not complete. There are things missing. There are things it can't explain. And we talked about this last time. The main one is abiogenesis, but that's not the only one. There are many things that don't fit, especially things about humans, human biology, human characteristics, and many other things as well. And I'll be talking about some of that. What I think is going to happen is that biology will progress the way physics did. For the same reason, we're stuck at this point. We're still getting good data and new knowledge about a lot of the details of how cells work, about the molecular biology and the biochemistry of life. but we're not making substantial progress in large areas. You know, it's like physics knew everything except what's going on with light. Okay, they couldn't figure that out, and we know everything except what's going on with the origin of life, and we're not getting there. We need a breakthrough, a paradigm breakthrough. As I've often said, I don't believe that God did it is an answer. I do believe that God did it, but God did everything.
Yeah.
So what I'm interested in is to learn more about how God did life, the same way we learn more about how God did the universe. Nothing we've learned in any science has ever eliminated God from the picture. In my view, it's just the opposite. We know there was a Big Bang, we know there was an origin of the universe, but we don't know how and why that happened. How sometimes we know things, why we never do. Now, is why something that should never be discussed in physics? I don't think so, or in any science. I think that sometimes we really do want to ask why. And I think life is one of those things. Why is there life? There shouldn't be life. Life should not exist. It doesn't make any sense that matter is crawling around and doing things. Mm-hmm. And some of the things that that matter does in living cells is remarkable. I mean, I'm not just talking about us, I'm talking about bacteria. They have purpose and they have agency. They act. They do things on purpose. Bacteria do that. And so do plants, and so do all animals, and of course we do too. Why is that? Where did that come from? Now, we can easily say, well, that's all evidence of God's existence, of God's, purposes, and that's absolutely true. But I think that we can also, maybe, I'm not sure about this, but I think we can approach it scientifically as well. But we need new theories. We need new ideas. We can't do it based on this purely reductionist, bottom-up view of biology, which is the dominant field right now. And even within evolution and within evolutionary theory, there are people, and again, not necessarily theists, who are making progress in that area. They are looking at things like agency and purpose, teleology, in current biological systems and asking the question, where did this come from? How did this happen? And looking for scientific answers.
Do you mind if we switch gears and talk about miracles?
Yeah.
So miracles. How? Because one way to put the conflict or the potential conflict between science and Christianity is that at the center of Christianity is this great miracle, the great miracle of the resurrection.
Right.
And so did that ever come up in your mind of like, how can I maintain my science, which is based on a sort of methodological naturalism where you're not allowing in any kind of external agency into your explanations. How did you resolve that conflict, that potential conflict between miracles on the one hand and the greatest miracle of all time, the resurrection? How did you, integrate that into your scientific worldview as a scientist?
Yeah, I with surprisingly little difficulty. And all I had to do was say, yeah, there's a lot of things we can't explain, but we know are true. We don't call them miracles. Now, and it doesn't mean that God stepped in and did them, but the fact that we can't explain the resurrection didn't bother me at all, because there are many things we can't. We can't explain what a quark is. We can't explain we can't explain what charge is. Why is an electron negative and a proton positive? I mean, we can talk about it, we can describe it, but we don't really explain it. That doesn't.
Are you saying that? Yeah, go ahead. Are you saying that miracles lack explanation?
No, actually, what I'm saying is that there are two things about miracles. How do you explain them?
Okay.
Scientifically, and That doesn't bother me because there's a lot in science, there's a lot in nature that we can't explain through science. But then the question is, okay, but Jesus rose from the dead. That never happens, right? So how do you explain that? And I don't know. You can't explain that or any miracle if you don't believe in God, because then all you can say is it didn't happen. But miracles happen, right? And there are examples of miracles that are indisputable. And so what people who are not religious say is, well, I don't know, but it happened. I mean, when doctors see something that they can't explain, which happens very, very frequently, by the way, they say, I don't know. I've never seen it before, but there it is.
Yeah,
it's
true.
true.
I don't know the explanation.
I don't know the explanation. Not going to find it, but it happened. Pastor, I think his name is Dwayne Miller, who got his voice back as a very famous, Lee Strobel talked about that. And I've heard that tape, and there's no question that happened. Nobody could explain it. This is
what's remarkable about these stories, some of them, is that, they happen at a specific time. The timing of them is what makes it peculiar. Right. And that's what really starts to raise questions, is that like, his voice came back in the middle of a sermon on, I think he was talking about healing.
Yes. At the moment that
he was talking about that.
The next moment, it's
and
remarkable.
And then his voice just came back.
Everyone should listen to that if they haven't already. Whether you're a believer or not, listen to that just as an example. But the resurrection was clearly not explainable, and yes, it's true that no human has ever risen from the dead and never will, unless they happen to be God incarnate. And Jesus Christ was God incarnate. And so, rising from the dead doesn't bother me. Now, if you're not a believer, you can't use that explanation.
Well, so what about the idea that the laws of nature are just so constant and so consistent that we can rule out these types of miracles? Is like the more likely explanation is going to be someone was lying, someone was mistaken. So these other options, these other natural options, seem a lot better than the miracle explanation.
And I don't know what percentage, anywhere from 20 to 90% of cases of reported miracles, that may be true. But it's certainly not true of all of them, and it's certainly not true of the resurrection.
It strikes me as bias against miracles, to say that in every case it's going to be more likely that it's mistaken.
Well, it's kind of like magic. It's something I talk about sometimes, is that we're told that this is all magic, and there are many magicians who are very, Penn and Teller is the best example, who are really fierce atheists.
Who are atheists, yeah.
And one of the things they like to do is show that their magic tricks there's nothing supernatural about them. And I dabble in magic. I used to dabble in magic a little bit.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, Can
you show me something right now?
I can't show it to you right now, but I can show it to you later.
Okay. I'm way too interested in this now. I wish I would have known, because then I would have had like a coin or something. Do we have something?
No, I can't. I have I could have brought it. I brought it with me to here.
What is it?
It's a trick.
What does it involve?
Oh, I can't tell you.
Okay.
This is being recorded. A magician is not allowed to do that. But I could demonstrate it for you later.
Okay.
Maybe. I was even thinking of doing it during my talk, but I have too much to say. So
okay.
I may bring it.
Sorry to get off track.
That's okay. But the point of this whole thing is that, magic tricks involve natural things. But there is something a little beyond that. The skill that a good magician, I'm not talking about myself here, but somebody like Penn, brings to the performance of magic is somewhat miraculous in a way. It's the miracle of humans being made in the image of God. I mean, what they can do, the psychological and the physical and the mental skills required to be a really good stage magician are to me at the same level of being an amazing composer or a brilliant poet or a brilliant scientist. They reflect the image of God. Nothing other than a human can do a good magic trick or even a bad magic trick. And where does that come from? To me, one of the miracles of nature is the nature of humans. In fact, I think I wrote somewhere that, we're used to miracles, and but we usually call it human nature. But again, back to the resurrection, that's a real miracle wherein it was a miracle that God came to us in the form of a man. Mm-hmm. And everything about that was incredible. He didn't come as a king. He came as a carpenter. He didn't come to reassure one tribe of people, and especially the wealthy among them. He came to reassure the sinners and the lost of all humanity. He told us that we are all worthy, all of us. Sinners, losers, the despised, the rejected. No one had ever said that before. These things are all miracles, even before the resurrection happened. No one had ever thought of these things. And he changed the world. There's no denying that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a historical fact. And
unless you're a Jesus mythicist.
Flat earthers, Jesus mythicists, they all belong together. I didn't say that. That I think somebody like Bart Ehrman actually said that. Anyway. Oh, someone, I don't remember who. But he changed the world. Mm-hmm. And of course he was resurrected because he's with us. He's alive. And he rules in heaven. And miracles don't bother me. And other miracles of a lesser kind, cure health, curing diseases, I see miracles so often that I may merge into maybe just good luck. I don't know, but I think that all of it, once you're a human, so much is miraculous, and so much can be traced back to this miraculous creation of humanity that God did.
The more I think about miracles and like laws of nature, the less inclined I am to use those terms, because it makes more sense to just ask, well, what has God done?
Yeah, and the laws of nature, that's a fascinating discussion, the whole issue of the laws of nature. Nobody knew there were laws of nature until, some Greeks, and then later the original Christian scientists began studying the laws of nature, trying to show that there were such things. And they were amazed. Nobody thought that the same law that it works on Earth would exist everywhere in the universe. Mm-hmm. So when Newton showed that was true, that was considered, and was, an amazing breakthrough in knowledge, that there are these universal laws of nature that apply everywhere and all the time. And that was a miracle. That was considered miraculous.
And it's not just that it exists everywhere throughout the whole universe, it's that we have this specific set of laws.
Right. And they're specific,
that all work together.
And they work together, and what is miraculous is that we can understand them. Mm. And we understand them mathematically, which is also miraculous, because mathematics is a very abstract, very human way of thinking. And we can express every law in nature we've discovered mathematically, and it works. And many people have said that doesn't make any sense. Why should we be able, with our ways of thinking, which includes mathematics, be able to write down a simple equation like F equals ma, right? Force equals, mass times acceleration. Why does that work?
Yeah.
That's like a fine-tuning argument. That's like God said, okay, I'm going to make it easy for you people, okay?
To figure out how the world works.
To figure out how the world works, and we did. And
because the world could have been way more chaotic.
Sure.
It could have been that when you throw a ball, it goes up, it goes down, it goes sideways.
Yeah. And it could have been
goes in a curve.
that the force equals, 13 other terms to the 8th power divided by the integral of something or other. I mean, there are some laws which are a little challenging in terms of calculus, but not for a mathematician.
Yeah.
Not for anyone who has studied it. So, it could have been, or it could have been lawless. The world could have been completely lawless. Now, what's interesting to me as a biologist is that there are no laws in biology. We have not found, we have a couple of mathematical laws in biology, but they're always being violated. There are always exceptions to biological laws.
Give me an example.
Okay, so we have, one of the few laws that we have is the what's called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. It has to do with genetics.
Okay.
And
you're going to have to break this down.
Yeah.
For me and the audience.
Yeah. I'm not going to write down the equation, but it's fairly simple. It tells you what how the various forms of a gene, which are called alleles, how the allele frequency changes. And the reason that was important was because when people first heard about evolution, they didn't understand, and then they heard about the early genetics, so that there are dominant and recessive genes. And people thought, well, if there's a dominant gene, eventually it's going to just take over, and that's the end. There won't be any. So how do you get evolution? And there were two mathematicians who heard about this independently, Hardy and Weinberg, two different guys. And they came up with a formula that showed that, no, there's an equilibrium between the dominant and the recessive forms of the gene. And it stays constant unless there's a selection for one of those alleles. And then it can change. And that's sort of one of the equations for evolution. And shows that evolution results in the change in allele frequency. And that equation is useful, but it's often violated. There are so many exceptions to that, because sometimes you get a third allele, which then works in concert with one of the other two. Biology is so immensely complicated. Biochemistry, molecular biology, cell biology is so incredibly complex that as soon as you start to try to write down an equation, you're going to find something that doesn't fit it. And I think that that's an amazing clue. To me, that itself is a pointer to God. It's not just that biology is complex, because complexity can be explained. The physical world is complex. You look at a storm system, it's very complex. But not at the level of biology. There's nothing that comes close to that. And every time you say something definite in biology, the best example is the central dogma, which is that DNA gives RNA, which makes protein. That was called the central dogma of biology, and it was started by Francis Crick, and it was called the central dogma because there's no exception. Proteins never make RNA. RNA never makes DNA, people thought. And DNA makes itself. Okay, so that turns out in 1970, I was just starting graduate school when two people, again independently, Barmas and Bishop, discovered that there's a virus made out of RNA, which makes DNA. The RNA makes DNA. And it's called, a retrovirus. And we're very familiar with those now. They include things like AIDS, HIV, and other well-known viruses. And it turns out that there's a specific enzyme called reverse transcriptase, which takes RNA and makes DNA out of it. So we had to revise the central dogma, put another arrow in, so that DNA to RNA also goes backwards. This happens all the time. All the time. I mean, we used to think that that junk DNA had no function. That there was a huge 90% of the genome had no function at all. Turned out that's not true. There's all kinds of function in DNA sequences that don't make proteins, but they regulate other genes. And they have all kinds of other functions. RNA, too complex to go into, but we're always learning new things. And half the time, the new things that we're learning contradict the other things that we thought we knew. So that's going to keep happening, and the good news about that is there's some reason for that. Now, theologically, it's clear to me is that the creation of life by God was miraculous and involved laws that we don't know yet. And scientifically, what's exciting is the fact that we don't know those laws yet, because if they're there, we'll find them. I won't see it, but I'm assuming that at some point, at least right now, I can prophesize that we will find new forces, new natural forces that apply to biology and biology only, to life.
So going back to your story, going back to like the beginning of this interview where we were looking at your journey from
Right.
atheism to Christianity and what that looked like and sort of entailed in the aftermath of it. So was there, when you eventually came out as a Christian to your friends and to your colleagues, what was the aftermath of that? What was there blowback? Was there...
A little. One of my best friends is an atheist, of course. All my friends were atheists.
Were they surprised?
Yeah, everybody was surprised. She was, this one particular person was surprised, but very accepting. Quite a few people had that kind of reaction. I think probably somewhere inside them they were saying, gee, too bad, I thought he was a smart guy. Others were a little bit more negative. Some of my colleagues in particular, although I didn't tell many people for quite a while. There was a lot of indifference, you know. I don't know what they were actually thinking. Some of them may have been thinking things that some of the commenters on our last video mentioned, you know. Well, he's getting old, he's getting, you know, afraid of death, whatever the excuses are for somebody who converts. And I'll just say right now that yes, a fear of death was something I experienced, but in my 20s, not recently. So that's not part of it. But one of the other things that I had to deal with was, frankly, the Bible, and that was tough.
What in particular?
Well, the whole Old Testament.
Okay.
Starting with Genesis and some other stuff. And I had never really read. I mean, I read the Gospels, which I loved, and later after then I read the rest of the New Testament, and I had no problem with almost any of it. Revelation is beyond me, but that's another story. But the Old Testament, I had difficulty, and luckily I was also reading some great theologians. John Walton.
John Walton is great.
He's wonderful. N.T. Wright. Who I had the privilege of meeting once, is a wonderful man.
Nice.
Brilliant theologian.
Kind of like Santa Claus.
Alistair McGrath. And what I learned was that, you know, the Bible is not a science book. It's not really even a history book in a way. It is in a way, but it's a series of books of all different genres. And yeah, it has all the defects that everybody says it has. It's contradictory, it doesn't make sense, it says all kinds of different things, it has heroes who are really villainous. I mean, King David? Nice guy? I don't think so. And then it struck me at some point, and I can't tell you when, it may have been when I was reading about King David, I realized this is a book about truth. This is not a book that's written to make you feel good about the world, about everything. It's written to tell you what is true. It's written to tell you.
All you have to do is read Ecclesiastes to really see that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, even the really hard ones like Numbers. I mean, you know, I mean, it was written. If you read it right, you see what the purpose of the writer was. It was the purpose of the Bible is to give glory to God and to tell the people reading it, this is what happened, and this is who you are as people. This is who God created. You're not wonderful. You're not perfect. You're good and you're bad. You're sad and you're joyful. You know, you're dumb and you're smart. You're humans. Mm-hmm. And you were made by God. You were created by God in His image. And that's a miracle. That's wonderful. That doesn't mean that you're living in heaven. You're not living in heaven. You're living in, you know, the world of tears, the vale of tears. And then you get to the New Testament and you find out, okay, that's not all there is. Mm-hmm. There is going to be heaven. There is salvation. And the Old Testament suddenly makes sense. It all fits together. That took a while to get to, but I eventually got there.
Yeah. You look at the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament.
Yeah. That's what I do now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay, maybe it's time to switch gears again
Mm-hmm.
and discuss. So something that came up in the last video is we made a little side comment about Catholics. And and I said, oh, Catholics, man, Catholics.
Right.
And it was actually, it wasn't just in like, we weren't trying to make fun of Catholics at all. It was...
I think you were talking about the friars, right?
Yes,
the Franciscans. Right.
But the question that I have related to this is, so when you became Christian,
Mm-hmm.
would you say that you became like, you embraced mere Christianity, and then you started to look at the different denominations
Yes.
and were trying to delineate which one is the correct denomination to join? And in the car ride, you were saying that Catholicism is one of the ones that you actually attempted to join first.
Well, I to be honest with you, I grew up in New York City.
Okay.
There were New York City, native New Yorkers are either Catholic or Jewish or atheist.
Okay.
Now, there are Protestants in Manhattan, but I grew up in Brooklyn, and the white Protestants were just rich people I never met. So I didn't know them. So I never knew an actual white Protestant, you know,
Wow.
Until I was in college, I think. I never considered Protestantism. I didn't know anything about it. To me, Christianity was Catholic.
Yeah.
And at some point, I was actually living in Italy, and
Lucky you.
yeah, it was nice, 10 years. And it was around the time that I came to faith, and I tried to join I went to the Catholic Church, and there was a priest who gave me instruction. He spoke English. And I said, I'm ready to be baptized, and it never happened. It didn't get through the higher authorities. Then I came to the U.S.
For very complicated reasons.
for reasons which are too complex. They were basically bureaucratic, having to do with my past life. I've had a very complex and somewhat stormy life. So, I've been married 3 times, and so this had to do with some of that. And then I came to the U.S. and tried again. I went to another long session in Pittsburgh Cathedral, where I was living in Pittsburgh, and got trained, and then I was told that I had to deal with some issues in past life which I could not deal with. So I gave up on being baptized. I thought, well, there's nothing I can do. It's not going to happen. And as I say in my book, and I'll repeat what you said, I have nothing but respect and admiration for Catholicism. I don't have that feeling for the bureaucracy of the church. I pray that the church will someday deal with that issue, along with some others. But the essence of Catholicism, I have no argument with. Mm-hmm. But I decided I really did want to be baptized, and I understood the importance of baptism. And so I decided, well, okay, I'll go to a Protestant church. I'd never been in one. And I went to a Methodist church by chance. The story is I thought I would become a Presbyterian because I knew Francis Collins was a Presbyterian. So I actually went to his church because I was living, at that point I was working at NIH, and I went to his church, but it was so crowded there was no parking space. So I couldn't stop. So I went to the next church, which was a Methodist church, and there was parking there. I walked in, I listened to this incredible sermon, which just grabbed me. And I went back the next Sunday, and again, beautiful sermon about love. It's just wonderful. And I went over to the preacher, to the pastor later after the service, and I told my story, and the response was, "Would you like to be baptized next Sunday?"
Wow.
And I said, "What? Is that possible? I mean, don't I need, don't I need an indoctrination, a course, whatever?" No. You have the Spirit. You have the Holy Spirit with you. It's clear. So come next Sunday, you'll be baptized. And that's what happened.
I think this story is going to resonate with our Protestant audience. The Catholic audience might be a little bit upset at hearing the whole bureaucratic issue.
Well, they may be upset, but they're lucky because they came from a Catholic family, or they married someone who was Catholic. They didn't have the kind of background I had.
Yeah.
Yeah, my background was tough.
So there's just no hope for you to join the Catholic Church?
I haven't found any. That would be different now. I'm already baptized.
Oh, okay.
So since I'm baptized, I think that will not be a problem. I'm not sure. I'd have to talk to the priest about that.
Okay.
But I have also lost my interest. I'm perfectly happy as in the Methodist Church.
And I don't blame you.
I've risen from being baptized. 5 years later, I became the lay leader. Not 5 years. 2 years later.
Do you teach at all?
I have done. I've given some courses in the church, within the church.
Sure. What do you teach on?
Well, it's an interesting story. I also learned a lot about other Christians. I thought, well, the Catholics already accept evolution, at least at the top, but I didn't know about Protestants. So after I joined, the pastor asked me if I would give a class on science and evolution, and I said, okay, I'll try to explain what it is. And I thought maybe 10 people might show up, and there were 60 people came. And I started out by saying, okay, how many people here believe that evolution is basically true? And I thought maybe 1 or 2 people would raise their hand. I think it was 58 people raised their hand.
58 out of 60.
58 out of 60. The 2 who didn't, I later convinced. So that was a wake-up call. I said, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? I thought Protestants,
Right.
Well, no. It turns out the majority of Protestants totally accept mainstream science. The young earth creationism, which, by the way, I am not strongly opposed to young earth creationism. I don't think it's correct. Mm-hmm. But I have no argument. I have very good friends who are scientists and young earth creationists, and we work together on various things that are...
Well, you're about to meet another one at the conference.
Yes, I know.
Marcus Ross.
Exactly.
And he's excellent. He's so good.
Yeah, and they have some good arguments. It turns out that I think most of those arguments are refutable, and I'm sure Michael will refute them. But because he's not a degreed scientist, but he knows a lot of science.
Yeah.
So, but I don't have any argument with them theologically because they're interpreting the Bible in a way which I don't agree with, but it's legitimate. And I don't think anyone has the right to say, no, you're wrong about the Bible. If you're a believer, if you understand that Christ rose and from the dead and is our salvation, you're a believer. And you want to interpret the Old Testament differently? Okay. It doesn't hurt me. You're a Christian, I'm a Christian. As long as we both agree on that, I don't care. I'm not out to proselytize for a scientific viewpoint. That's not my job. It's not my interest. But, having said all that, I found out that young earth creationism derives originally from Seventh-day Adventism, and then was eventually absorbed into the Southern Baptist Convention in the 60s after the book, The Genesis Flood, came out, Henry Morris. It's not the original interpretation of Scripture at all. It's a brand new 19th century interpretation, originally from George Price McCready.
There's so much of that around in Protestant churches.
Yeah. And many Protestant churches, not just Baptists, but many churchgoers hold to that particular interpretation. But it's not a literal interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you hear someone say, "I believe literally in the word is written," no, they don't. Nobody does. But they're interpreting Genesis in a way that is different the way I interpret it. I interpret Genesis as being very supportive of the evolutionary theory, but that's a whole subject we can't get into.
Yeah. Well, maybe we will. Maybe, I mean, this is just one of many interviews, hopefully, that we'll do together.
Might. Yeah,
so,
okay.
So hopefully next time we'll be able to get into that.
Maybe so.
But it actually might be time to wrap up the interview. Is there anything that we haven't discussed so far that you would like to touch on before we close it out?
Well, I think the closing will be similar to what my closing last time, and that is that I had to struggle not just to reach faith, but once I reached faith, I had to struggle a little bit with many questions that start with, what about? Okay, what about the Bible? What about, Christian, whatever, evil, whatever? And I met every one of those struggles and came through it to the point where, in many cases, the result of that struggle was an enhancement, a strengthening of my newfound faith. So what I should probably end with is this. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt is part of faith. Doubt is the opposite of certainty, okay? And uncertainty is scientifically valid. The uncertainty principle is a fundamental bedrock of physics. And it's fine to be uncertain, and it's fine to doubt. When you have a doubt, and we all do, I do, you do, everyone does. When you have a doubt, don't throw it away. Don't put it aside. Don't bury it under a rock. Explore it. Because God is real and God is good, and God will guide you through that doubt and show you the answer. It doesn't matter what the doubt is. It could be the horrendous problem of evil, which we didn't talk about, but I have a whole chapter devoted to that. And it's a hard question. It doesn't have an answer. And it's worthy, it's worthwhile to have doubts about God because of evil. But if you explore that enough, you won't find the answer of why God allows evil, but you will find that God is real anyway. It's hard to go into detail how to explain why that's true, but I feel that very strongly. So don't worry about having doubts. Don't suppress them. Bring them up. And this is one of the roles of apologetics. Go to someone who is an apologist, who knows apologetics. Go to a theologian. Ask those questions. Read the answers. N.T. Wright has books on this, which are C.S. Lewis books. So many people have, Lee Strobel, has books which will address those doubts and will help you. And even if they're not totally answered, they're answered enough. And have faith that all of those questions and all of those doubts will eventually be answered for you. For me, probably sooner than most of the rest of you, but they will be answered, because that's what salvation means, to reach the answer.